Okay, good evening, everyone. It's 7:30. I'm going to start the session now. There are very few students online, but I'm going to proceed on. I just want to check in again and say good evening. Let me touch base. How are you? Apologies for last week. I had a personal challenge that I had to deal with, so apologies for the session that needed to be cancelled. I did upload the recordings for those sessions, and if you have any questions, you're also more than welcome to reach out. But on the chat, just an indication, how are you doing? Are you well? Are you coping? Are you managing? How are you feeling? Just on the chat, if you have a moment to just check in. Okay, so this evening we're focusing on purely all the questions that you have for task 3, if there are any. Also, just to provide clarity for the few emails that I've received regarding the task. And I'm sure your supervisors are checking in and need to provide support for you as well, over and above the clarity that you receive in this session. But if there's anything that you're a bit uncertain of, I hope that you find the responses or answers for them. And whatever I don't know, I will find out and bring that information back to you, should there be anything you ask over and above what I've prepared this evening or what I can answer. I will also communicate with you where needed. So you've done task 1 and 2 of this proposal, and now you're at the final stretch to do task 3. And ultimately, after task 3 comes the major part where you're going to summarize or do the final summary of your proposal or put it together. So task 3 in itself has an outline that is clear, that is given to you, and I'm going to ask that you visit your chapter 20 in your textbook as we go through this particular section. Chapter 20 is probably the blueprint or the guide that you would need to ensure that you are abiding by everything that the rubric for this particular task is asking. So in conjunction with your textbook, it's also important that you look at your draft or at your current work that you have. I wanted to send a communication asking that you should have access to both your textbook and maybe print out to make the needed notes on your hard copies. But I thought, let's just work through it, and I'm sure you're going to make the needed notes where you need to. So ideally, at the end of this particular session this evening, you should have a clear idea of all the key aspects that I've laid onto this particular slide. So each one of you do have a title for your current studies. And that title could be a work in progress. You could still be making updates onto it based on the feedback that you've been receiving. But ideally, more or less, you have an idea what your title or your study is about. You're also going to provide context of your study. You're going to take a dive into literature to formulate your literature review, and that could also lean towards a theoretical framework if that's the approach you're taking. You're going to put together a problem statement, describe your methodology, touch on a bit of feasibility and why that's important to include. You're going to take ethical considerations. You cannot write your proposal without that. You're going to emphasize or indicate where there's limitations and also what contributions your study will be making. So these are the key things that at the end of your proposal, you should have touched on all these elements to gain the needed marks. So I've broken them down and taken the screenshots from the actual Excel document or rubric and just embedded them into my slides. So there's nothing different from what you have. But we're going to take a pause at all. I think there's 11 key things that we need to talk about, and we'll pause at each one to check in if you are comfortable with that particular section of your work. And you can then give me some insight whether or not you are still working on it, need clarity, or you'll still revisit this particular point. So in essence, it starts off with your title. And if you are going to refer to your textbook, page 326, the title should be concise as possible. So generally what they require is about 10 words or less. But in most cases, it's not always possible to get to that 10 words to make the emphasis you want to make or to give a clear title as you would want, but generally shorter titles and that's straight to the point or has a that stands out and has a punch to it. That's generally what the markers will gravitate towards, something that's clear, precise, and to the point. But the aim of your title is to communicate the importance of your study. The textbook is not very helpful regarding drafting this section of the feasibility and ethical considerations. Are there other sources that we can use that is more helpful in drafting the section? Anel, I prepared my discussions primarily based on or off of your prescribed textbook, but I have my own personal sources that I use that I could share with you as well. But generally, the basics of what they want you to know is embedded in this particular textbook. I'll show you where I've made my notes specifically for feasibility and ethical considerations. And then you may pop me an email and just ask for additional guidelines for additional textbooks or sources that could be helpful to build on that. But you do need to reference this particular textbook as well in your study somewhere as a guide. Okay, but I'll make a note of your request as well. So first up is our titles, and all of you should have a particular title. I wanted to pause and ask, okay, can you share your titles? And I thought that might be a bit elaborate. Maybe some of you do not want to share your titles. But I am going to ask that you just on the chat with regards to your title, just give me a thumbs up or as from, let's take a score from 1 to 10. How confident are you with your title? Are you there at 100%? Your title was confirmed and approved by your supervisor. You've got a 10 if you think about your title. Are you sitting somewhere on a 5 in between, or are you still below 5, figuring it out as you go about it? So just to get a sense, where are your confidence levels with regards to your title or what you've structured so far? That's nice, and I'm happy. I'm glad that there's support there from the supervisor to give you that confidence. Anil, it can be tricky, sometimes subjective based on which perspective you look at it. If you're very unsure, perhaps discuss with the supervisor or take a step back a bit and think about the overall importance of your study and reword it a bit. But it's definitely something that's going to give the reader a clear or should give a clear insight as to what exactly your study is about. Majority of you are sitting on the upper scale of the towards the 10, so that's great. But there are two options if you're not confident yet, your supervisor and just a bit more focus as to what exactly is my study about and narrow that down a bit. But thank you for your responses on this one. So I'm going to move on to something key that was highlighted that I need to reiterate this evening. Please ensure that your research is focused on higher education institutions or around some leaning towards teaching and learning or the context of what this particular course is about. So I just wanted to check in, has this been emphasized in semester 1? Are you all more or less aligning your studies with a higher education institution, or are there any questions about this? Just a thumbs up if you are on the right track. There was, I think, a few cases last year where students selected the wrong topics. They focused on their current studies or current work environments that was not necessarily aligned correctly. So they wanted this evening that we just touch base here and make sure that your study from the onset is focused on higher education institutions. I'm glad there's a lot of thumbs on the screen, so I'm going to take this as a yes for majority of us. It does not have to specify private or public as long as it's within the higher education context. That should be fine. Private higher education, university, colleges, any teaching spaces that are tertiary, in my understanding. Okay, so then it brings us to the next point, which is the context of our study. Now, the context of our study needs to be embedded in two key things. Number one, the purpose of your study, what it's about, and it also needs to give some kind of background or rationale. I just want to open because I see it's cut off a bit to make sure that I'm mentioning everything. Okay. Okay, the context of the study. Okay, it is correct. I just wanted to check if I'm cutting anything off at the bottom. So generally what we do is we lean towards, or for my students, I would like to mark in the 9 to 10 or even the 11 to 12 bracket or column of the rubric, far right side of the rubric. And that's all that I'll emphasize this evening. I'm not necessarily going to discuss what you would do wrong, but emphasize on what the key things are that you should do. So note for your context that you need to emphasize the purpose of your study again. And if the purpose is not clear, try to take a step back to narrow it down. I know the overall amount of pages is 20, so you also don't want to be too elaborate on what you need to say and just cut it down specifically to what exactly the purpose of your study is. But do give some context and background of your particular context of your study. So tell us a bit about the background and all the aspects that impact or that give a clear rationale of your study. The context of the study should be described, and many aspects of the context are incorporated or included in it, and they are linked or related to one another. So if you make different points, they're still speaking to the same thing. The description is thick enough to elucidate the general context of the study. So if you're describing, let's say, teachers within their first year at a private higher education institution, give clear background, rationale, context, describe it in such a way that I can almost formulate a picture of what it is that you want to say. And even more important, that you start leaning towards the argument or emphasizing what the gap actually is that you are alluding to or leaning towards but in your particular study, or what will be addressed in this proposed study. If you make that connections, then it's easier for us to see the bigger picture of what you are trying to unpack. So the context of your study is super important because it gives us a glimpse into where exactly the study stems from, or where are we. It's a starting point. No problem, thank you. Okay, the next point is our literature review. Please can you clarify whether our task 1 justification section was preparation for this? I would say yes and no. Yes, in the sense that depending on what the feedback was that you've received, if the feedback gave you the thumbs up and you understood or it's clear, then you can take from that and utilize it or incorporate sections of it here. So depending on more or less what the feedback was for that particular task. So I can say yes, but generally it depends on what feedback you received back. Because sometimes it could be justification, but if it was done incorrectly or there's something that's missing from it or not substantiated clearly, then it also could perhaps need some work to it. We are meant to get marks on task 1 and 2, or we will get marks once our entire research has been completed. Ndivyo, you're supposed to have received marks, in my understanding, for task 1 and task 2 already. May you indicate on the chat if you'd like me to look into that? Is the marks not released? I was under the impression that they are. So generally, you would have received feedback and a mark for those two tasks. For those two tasks. Let me know on the chat if you have not. I can look into that as well. And that's probably for all of us online. Have you all received your marks for the first two tasks? So task 1 and 2, yes or no? Okay. So there has been. Okay. So generally those marks were released and it would give you a guideline more or less where you're standing now. Yes, I would say look into that. Perhaps there was a matter that your supervisor would still be marking it. And perhaps if you query that. Alternatively, you can send me an email. I can also follow it up for you if you like. I did, but I had no feedback. I would say request the feedback from your supervisor, or just check on the Learn platform if there is not an option where those feedback options, or we use the rubric, and we upload, or in my case, I'll upload a rubric and comments of the actual marking that I did. But generally check with your supervisor, or perhaps just double check on the Learn platform if you might have missed it or have not seen the upload. Okay, so the next aspect is your literature review, which I'm sure majority of us would at this point have an idea or more or less what you need to do. I always refer right back to page 14, where it gives us the basic triangle that outlines exactly what a research or a literature review is about. And it starts at the bottom where it indicates start with a research database, work your way up to stage 2, where you're going to focus on specific articles. And then at the end, focus those articles specifically on your problem that you're identifying or emphasizing. And then there's a whole chapter on literature review as well that will give you context around the different types of literature reviews. I think it starts from page 114, where you can now directly home in on the type of style you want to use to write, or the type of requirement for your particular literature review. So if you're taking a historical view, perhaps you are going to write from a chronological way that you dive into literature to find a timeline for certain things, or perhaps you're using a thematic view where you're going to look for certain concepts in the articles. So depending on what approach you're taking in your writing, you would lean towards your writing style and where your strengths are. So my advice would then be to reflect back on that chapter, starting somewhere page 114, and review it again so that you provide a clear understanding of the current state of knowledge about your particular problem. Now, I don't know if it was emphasized to you in the semester 1 of how far back the articles that you search for should be. So I just want to touch base and ask you, was it emphasized that they should not be older, hopefully, than 10 years, or what was the guideline given to you regarding the sources that you should find for the literature review? No guidelines? Okay. Anybody else? Did your supervisor perhaps mention how old your sources should be? No guidelines. Okay. So generally what we try to do is not to lean too far back on articles that are not relevant for the current state of knowledge about your selected problem. So my advice would be to lean towards as current as possible. So Anel is correct. 5 years is generally where the fresh knowledge would be, or more relevant or current your write-up would be. And I generally am lenient up to a point where it's no older than a decade, not older than 10 years. But if the librarian mentioned it, and it's probably the IIE VC librarian that I'm hoping you're leaning towards, or quoting there, Anel, if it is the IIE's one, then let's align with as much as possible. Now we have what we call seminal works. These are sources that you cannot work around it. They are explicit. They came up with the original as tasks or ideas or concept. Those deep-rooted, let's say Vygotsky's work, for example, you cannot work around it. His work will be older than a decade, and you use it to perhaps give you that theoretical background that you're looking for. So if it's those seminal works that you cannot work around, that is going to define something in your study, you can use it, because those are substantiated. We understand why researchers use those deep-rooted, knowledgeable sources where theorists have come up with something awesome that we all build from. So generally, those seminal works you can use as old as they are or backdated as they are. But the researchers that speak towards your knowledge of your specific topic, try and keep it as current as possible. The more current your writing is, the more relevant it is to our context today and higher education institutions today, and it will allow your marker to see that you have made the effort to find what is relevant now. And I think it's more of a concern now because there's AI tools that some of our students are using. And when you're leaning towards those AI tools, they also give you various articles or sources that you can use that sometimes spread across different timelines. So if you keep them within 5 years, as fresh as you possibly can, I would say don't expand older than 10 years. And perhaps if you want clarity, just touch base with your supervisor to confirm more or less what their preference or understanding is as well. But the aim of it is to keep your arguments relevant and to keep the point that you're trying to make, the knowledge that you're emphasizing, current. So with that being said, column 9 on the rubric asks that you use most of the major works that are included, particularly pertaining to your topic, and the sources are well organized. They are clearly developing your main argument, and a good attempt has been made to synthesize the literature or discuss the topic in a broader context that is based on scholarly works or based on literature and based on sources. So try not to have a paragraph or without referencing in it to back up your perspective or your views. And then also try to write in a logical manner that we can follow. And they call it a golden thread, where we can see the links from where you're introducing your topic all the way to where you're emphasizing your main arguments. I hope that helps or gives some context. I'm just going to say lit review on the chat and just ask you more or less, are you okay with this particular section? And I'm going to move on to the next one. So for literature review, you may just indicate on the chat thumbs up or down, or are you still with me, so that I can move on to the problem statement. Okay, thanks, Ndo. Appreciate it. Okay, so the next aspect that's quite important is the problem statement. And on page 329, it's introduced. If our lit review was successfully handled, yes. So if it was, and there are aspects that you've done quite well, you can copy and paste it into your task 3, but also now fit it nicely into to read well with what follows after. But you're correct, if that has been done and you're confident, you can use it as it is. Okay, so then the problem statement follows next, and here basically you indicate what your main issues are and must be related to the purpose of your study. And when you do that, you're linking back to a previous section, which means that golden thread can be followed throughout. What's important in the problem statement aspect is, if you look at, let's look at column where you get 6 or 7. The problem statement should be clear, strong argument, and good reference to literature. The bottom part is what I want to emphasize here, that the research paradigm has been considered in the identification of the research problem. Now, the research paradigm, in my understanding, has been covered in your previous task already. So based on the feedback you've received there, your paradigm is also a copy and paste, or in addition to linking it and writing it within your problem statement. How many pages should the literature review have? It's a tricky question to ask because of the structure of your entire work. There's no page specific outline in the rubric that says for this particular section write 5 pages, for this particular section write 4. However, the consolidated work will be 20 pages long. So I would say draft everything, and where you need to cut sections to fit within the page limit, it should give you clarity whether you have written too much or too little. I know that doesn't really answer the question explicitly, but the guidelines does not explicitly tell us what exactly or how many pages. It more or less speaks about, have you covered the elements that is necessary for that particular literature review. So in essence, to answer the question, I would say write everything out until you've done everything, then narrow down where the portions are elaborate to fit it within the 20 pages and still emphasize and tick all the boxes for what the key elements of the rubric are that we're going through this evening. and then perhaps touch base with your supervisor. Am I only one who cannot see the screen? My marker was very strict with the... everybody else seems to be able to see the screen, I would hope. Perhaps in the war, I have no idea. Can I just double check? Okay, yeah, it is accessible. Hopefully everybody can see. Not sure what you could do on your side, perhaps log out and in or refresh on your side. Okay, the markers are very strict, and especially the more you progress to the higher tasks, the more stricter we become. So try to stay within the length that is required. The research proposal to read it already is extensive for 20 pages, so don't overextend it. You make the read longer, and then it becomes a challenge for the marker or the reader. So stick to the deadlines, to the page numbers as much as you can. And almost the sections where you can see your are elaborate, and in most sections that I've experienced is the literature review, where students often try to be as concise as you can, to speak to the point, and also not to fluff too much with things that you don't necessarily have to repeat or have to emphasize again if you already have said it in a previous section. But a tricky write-up, perhaps try and discipline yourself to stay within the page limit. Okay, so problem statement needs to incorporate your paradigm, and the paradigm was done in task 1. So I'm hoping that you have a clear idea as to more or less what you're leaning towards, depending on the approach that you've taken for your study. And should you have challenges, you are more than welcome to email or reach out to your supervisor. Next up, we've got the methodology section, which is also introduced on page 329. And then it also splits into 2 chapters in the textbook, where one alludes to qualitative and one to quantitative. I uploaded 2 recordings in the week, one for qualitative and one for quantitative, just to give a touch base on the relevant instruments for the particular research, whichever aligns to your particular study. And hopefully you already have this particular, you've got an idea more or less what your methodology is and the corrections you should make in this one. So I'm just going to touch base on the chat and ask, in terms of the methodology and the instruments that you need to design for your study. If you have qualitative or quantitative, how confident are you, or have you already started to design your instruments? So perhaps, for example, if you have a qualitative study, you are leaning towards an interview. If you have a quantitative, perhaps you've got closed-ended questionnaire. What do you have an idea more or less regarding the instruments? I just want to pause there for a second and ask. So you can just again on the chat thumbs up or thumbs down, or have you not in particular start with this section or have any questions here. But ideally, the research method is thoroughly introduced here, and you're going to build an argument. Okay, so what we do is, or we consider, when you are doing a qualitative study, there are instruments that align with qualitative. And when you are doing a quantitative study, this is where we're going to look at which instruments you have done. I just want to open my guide so I can indicate where you can look or follow with me on the chapter 20 that we are busy with, just for a guideline here. So on page 332, it's where I highlighted in my textbook just a summary for this evening. The data collection methods that you can consider for a qualitative study: interviews, as I've mentioned, focus groups as well, ethnography or other forms of fields of research. Participant observations are also an option. Questionnaires with open-ended questions are for qualitative. Take note that the questions should lead your participants to elaborate on something. And then obviously you can also use a case study, which I've seen in 2 of the examples that was inquired on email. Quantitative, on the other hand, could be an experimental design, measure instruments with a Likert scale, where you've got from 1 to 5, from agree to disagree, depending on what your approach is. And here you can have closed-ended questions. So generally, yes, no, it's direct. It doesn't give space for the participant to elaborate or add on or share their perspectives necessarily. So look or think about the approach you are taking for your particular study, and have in the back of your mind a instrument that is going to align with how you want to ask your particular questions. I also in the recording touch base briefly, but it is in the textbook as well, the way you should structure your questions and what you should say and how you should ask them. If it's an open-ended question, what does that mean? And how should you avoid certain mistakes as well? Sometimes we ask a question that is two-folded or that has a double meaning to it, or that could be misleading for the person who's going to answer your questionnaire. So it gives quite clear guidelines as to what questions you should and should not ask, and mistakes that researchers often make. Please review the recordings that are uploaded in the week just for some guidelines, and it will be helpful for us to discuss again once you have designed your instruments for you to touch base with questions as well. I'm using purpose of sampling. Do I need to include a table on my population parameters? I would say yes. Are these questions added as an appendix or added to the research methodology section? So the questions generally is going to take up too much. If you look at it, that you've got 20 pages already that you're going to condense for the write-up. So I would say anything that you can add as an appendix would be the safer route to take. And you will refer to it in your write-up. Hope that answers your question, Anya. Must we elaborate on the theory of methodology or just describe our choices? You're always going to elaborate a bit, give us an introduction, and then you describe the data collection methods, almost to find that link. So give us the theory of a methodology first, your approach, your chosen options, why, and then you allude to a specific data collection method, for example, an interview, and then you could say refer to Appendix A and unpack the questions there. If you've got very brief questions that won't take up much of your space, you can embed it in your writing, but generally we attach anything that's going to take up space as an appendix so that you don't, at the end, underwrite on the elements where you needed to elaborate. The appendix is then not part of the page count. Yes. So anything, the appendix and the references then fall outside of that page limit. Okay. Then what's also important here is the aspects regarding validity, reliability, and trustworthiness. I'm going to touch on that a bit later, but take note that your instruments that you incorporate, there should be a justification for why these particular instruments, and how are you going to make sure that the strategies are, what strategy are you going to ensure that it is valid, that it is reliable, and that it is trustworthy. There is a chapter that covers it. I'm going to touch base on it in a little bit when I speak about feasibility, but note that you need to make the links and to give that justification for your particular methodology that you, or data collection method that you've chosen. So what I was referring to on the previous slide is this aspect here regarding feasibility of the study. And you can see feasibility follows after the methodology. So it means there's a golden thread. There's something, a link that they want you to make from the instrument to this particular portion. Now, this is key, and I think I'm putting a tip more or less for you on the slide, and you're more than welcome to touch base with your supervisor to see if it is correct. But generally, when you're doing a quantitative study, your write-up would lean towards reliability and validity. And if you're doing a qualitative study, we unpack trustworthiness with 4 key things. We speak about credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. Now, there's not enough time to teach or unpack these fully, but I am going to touch base in the textbook just to give you some guidelines around this particular portion. So if you could just make a note, or on your side, page 288. So this is where they start unpacking validity, reliability, and trustworthiness, and they almost split it into two. So if you're writing from a quantitative perspective, they want you to emphasize validity and reliability, and you'll see that on page 289. And I think it goes until page 290. And when you are writing from a qualitative perspective, keywords that we need to embed in our write-up are those 4 keywords, and it doesn't really matter what are you writing, a proposal, a research article. Generally, we need to emphasize around these trustworthy to show that in a qualitative study, you're not going to be biased, and these are how you are going to make sure that you're not biased by ensuring credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. You'll see these from page 295 all the way to page 297. I'm going to pause. Okay, let me go to the rubric first before I ask. So for you to get 6 to 8 marks on this, the feasibility of the study is discussed, and the relationships between feasibility of various elements of the studies are considered. That various elements of the study, depending if it's quantitative or qualitative, it will allude to the breakdown that I've just given. So all that you need to do, for example, is consider what does credibility mean for your particular study. So if you're doing qualitative study, credibility is going to refer to how accurate are you as the researcher, and can you accurately interpret the responses that you're going to get from each of your participants, and how are you going to do that. Take a bit of a deep dive into this particular aspect in the textbook and align accordingly for your particular write-up. I hope that helps. And if you've got any questions, you can touch base on the chat, but also just put a sticky note or a note on your to consider that with regards to feasibility in your write-up as well. Okay, ethical considerations we more or less touched on when we did our first intro session around the ICE task. And it's almost in reverse in the ICE task, where we ask you the opposite of it. And so here in your proposal, we're now asking you to write explicitly towards the ethical considerations for your particular study. Chapter 18 itself, you can draw so much, or in my opinion, you can draw from it. I just want to go to it where I've made my notes. So if you can refer to page 18, you'll see, I know it was noted earlier on that it does not really give you the depth depending on how much you want to write. However, for a 20-page write-up, there is insights you can draw from it to make inference. But should you need additional sources, you are also welcome to email me for, I generally use a grassroots research textbook for mine. Okay, so collecting the data from your participants, dealing with sensitive information, avoiding harm, confidentiality, how to remain anonymous, not to deceive them, all those ethical issues that researchers need to mention are key. And now, if you noted in our previous discussions where we spoke about, for example, qualitative research has a lot of bias in it, how are you going to avoid not being biased in your selection of your participants? How are you going to protect their identity? How are you going to ensure that it is not harmful? Is your participants under 18? How are you going to protect them and not exploit them? So all that kind of considerations is generally what we would like to see in your approach here. For 6 to 8 marks, a student asked me, so how much do you mention here? I would say generally align with what exactly is applicable for your particular study. Look at the sample that you have selected. Let's say if you are going to choose 5 first-year students who are doing management, and you need to look at how are you going to protect those 5 students' identity? How are you not going to cause them any harm? How are you going to not be deceitful for that particular sample that you're dealing with? So the rubric says discussion of the ethical considerations is substantial and adequately considers the ethical implications of the proposed research methodology. So remember, if it's qualitative, there is bias aspects that you need to speak to, and also how you're going to alleviate them. Again, it throws back to validity and reliability or trustworthiness, depending either or, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. And you're going to show ethical research practice. You have to discuss the measures that will be put in place for that ethical research practice. So that's basically what they want to see. And generally, in the consent form, in your interaction with the participants, they would have given you consent. They would have been clear on the aspects or the approach your research is taking. So when you do that or show that, you would receive the needed marks there. Also avoid distorting the information or falsifying the information. We have what we call in the qualitative study triangulation. So when you're collecting data from more than one source, in order to almost ensure that if you receive responses 3 different ways, to avoid the bias in it. So consider elements that you would or steps you would take to alleviate or to take away from the bias in a qualitative research discussion, and perhaps touch base with the supervisor on that as well. Next up, we've got what is called the limitations to the study. Now, generally, this should not be too difficult for you to write up, and also should not be stuff that you need to make up. It's generally you describing the constraints or the limitations that are out of your control. We normally speak about the time constraints, participants that are not completing a consent form completely, they're skipping questions, whatever impacted or you envision could impact your particular study. Some of us, we're going to look at a first year sample of 5 students, and you could perhaps consider that that does not give you a bigger or clear picture of all the students that you would have wanted to reach or in the entire population. Those are things that you're going to mention here as part of your limitations. You can dig a bit deeper into what it is in the textbook on page 214 to give you some context if you are a bit stuck in what exactly you need to write. And for 5 marks, the discussion contemplates the effects of these limitations on the validity and reliability, trustworthiness. So again, lean back into that particular feasibility section and draw from the aspects that limit your studies reliability, for example. If you know that a certain amount of students is what you needed for a credible amount of data, and not all of them came, that's going to impact, it's a limit onto your particular study. And yes, you have not conducted the study as yet, so we are preempting here on what you can see is a limit to your study. I hope that helps. It is a bit of a catch-22 because you haven't conducted the study as yet, but here we envision what those limitations are based on what you can control and cannot control. So think about that a bit in your write-up when you get to the limitation section. Yes and no, Anel, it is opinion-based, but also, let me go back to that slide. So if I say on page 214, it speaks about it, or it alludes to limitations, then perhaps your opinion backed up with what a source is saying. So I would generally say time constraint is a challenge for this particular study. And as Deploy Solier says in page whatever, this particular, and it is emphasized as well or proven by so-and-so, that time is generally a concern. So yes, but because it's an academic writing, it's generally with the backup of or substantiated by a source. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to go back. So after the contributions, limitations, we have contributions. So here you have to think of what contribution will this particular study make to the body of knowledge. So discussions of the anticipated contribution. So we're not asking you to think about what it has done, but what it will do or what you envision it will do. Try and make it as detailed as possible, show good insight on the purposes of this particular research and the possibility that this research design or what the possibilities of the impact would be. For example, in my current research paper that I'm busy with, I'm envisioning to create a guideline, something that will inform policy, something that could be a workbook for a particular teacher. So you could look at what is it that you want to contribute to the broader body of knowledge. There could not be a wrong answer there, only an omitted answer. So if you don't put anything down here, you're going to lose marks. But the more detailed you are to show that there's meaning and intention behind your research study, that's basically what they're looking for. And then, of course, the reference guide is key, and avoiding AI. And if you use it smarter, use it and reference and acknowledge it as now indicated in the updated reference guide. You're going to in-text, please, and also a reference list at the end. Try and cross-check the amount or whoever is embedded in text should be listed in the reference list. This, I'm sure majority of us on the call are aware of. I also then just wanted to reiterate the reference guide, which I'm sure you have, and again touch base on a reference manager that I love using. I don't write any references anymore. It's pulled from a reference manager of any preference that you might have, and I would want to challenge you to think about using them. And yes, maybe some of us are comfortable with referencing the manual way, but if you are open for the challenge, I want to give you an opportunity. Perhaps if you want it, you may also opt not to, or maybe find out about it on your own. But should you wish to attend a referencing training manager, if you are interested in Mendeley Reference Manager software training, you may reach out, and I'm going to put it together for the students I'm supervising and also for students generally who are interested, so that you could save time by using a reference manager, and also it allows you to embed them correctly, almost with hyperlinks. So if you are interested, you may please pop me an email so I can add you to an additional session for this. And it's going to be a working live active session where you do it as we train. And I think it is meaningful. It's changed my entire approach for research, and my love for writing then is focused on what I'm writing on, not necessarily am I worried am I leaving a reference out or doing something incorrectly that could be penalized or picked up at a later stage. So if you are interested, you're more than welcome. Please pop me an email. I generally love sharing tools and tech components of teaching and learning. So if you want to be part of this training, please do reach out as well. Then in conclusion of this evening session, thank you for showing interest on the chat. I appreciate that. It makes research so much more pleasant, if that's the best English I could use this evening. So I'm hoping that you would send me an email. The software is free, so there's no cost involved. We use the free version and it works seamlessly. I've never upgraded to pay anything as yet. And I'm using it for over 4 years now. So it's a database that generally keeps all my sources, and I can go back and insert it, and you instruct it how you want it to reference, and then just pull from it your references. And it also makes you feel academic, or for me, let me speak for myself. Okay, so I'm going to wait for your emails to come through in the week regarding that, and then I will set up the training for us. Okay, one of the things that Inez asked me just to emphasize this evening so that we're all on the same page, and this is probably the most important thing I was supposed to say this evening, is the ethical clearance annexures are loaded for you. Now, apparently a recording is going to be shared as well, but just for us this evening who are on the call, you have the clarity now as well that there is an ethical clearance annexure tab already loaded on the Learn platform under more resources, just above the lecture slides tab. And when you click on it, it has all the listed annexures that you need to submit with your write-up on the Learn platform when you are submitting your task 3. So it has a declaration form. It has the proposal cover page. Then it has the annexures GA, annexure GB, your annexure H, O, and Q. I just want to get my notes on how it is explained, but generally declaration form, proposal page, and the ethics clearance application, all of us do it. The ethics consent request form. Note that if you are using a participant and respondent informed consent form, you all have that or should have it for consent for your participants. Then if you are using a institution outside of the IIE, then you need to ask them for consent and a gatekeeper letter is required. And if you're collecting data, NQF8 and undergraduate research ethics application form as well. To confirm, can we submit more than one document to submission portal, or do we have to compile all of the annexures to one document? Okay, in the past, I saw students are able to upload more than one on one submission. So perhaps just give it a try. So you can have more than one submission. You don't have to condense the document in a zip folder, or it allows you to add or upload more than one. So give it a shot. That's how I've seen it done in the past. Please can I ask, do we have a timeline of how and when the project will proceed? Karen, are you referring to next year or after the final proposal is put together? So I'm going to give you my view from how it's done currently. I just want to go back and check, did I answer Anel's question? So just for clarity, you're going to upload all these documents as one by attachments, basically selecting everything you want to select and click submit, and they all upload together, but in separate. I hope I'm making sense. So you don't necessarily have to condense them in one document PDF and then upload. You're going to upload them as single attachments in your one submission. I hope that makes sense. If you struggle with it or need to share screen so I can show you, that you're also welcome to pop me a call or just check in. Please can I ask, how do we have a timeline of how and when the project will proceed? Maybe if you can unmute to ask me your question, just for clarity. When you ask me how does it proceed, just provide me context.
Okay, hi. When I found the postgrad handbook, finally, on it was at the library and eventually gave me the link. In the handbook, it says that we would be provided with a timeline with strict dates of when, step by step, of how this project proceeds, and we've never had that. So I don't know when I'm going to be sending out surveys, when I'm going to be organizing interviews, when I'm going to be doing whatever part, steps of the project, and then collecting that data. Then when am I going to be analyzing it? How does it actually work from now?
Okay. So basically what's going to happen after task 3, you're going to put the entire proposal together for the main submission. That main proposal is then what we call a defense almost, where we as the supervisors present your topic to a committee, let's call it that. And the committee will then give feedback and approve or ask for corrections on a particular topic. You will then receive the feedback from your supervisor saying, Anel van Rooyen, well done. Your documentation, your proposal has been accepted, you will then thereafter be able to conduct your study based on the letter that you receive of ethical clearance, basically. So after this particular or the final proposal that you're going to put together in your summative, that proposal is defended, and based on the outcome of the defense, you will need to make corrections, or you'll receive a letter saying ethical clearance granted. Once you have that letter, you will be able to start collecting your data. Now, in the past, it was only done later in the year, around October, September, October, and then in November, you're busy with all your other assessments. So generally, students only start collecting data in the new year. But if you want to push, you are able to do it as soon as you receive your ethical clearance letter. I will make a note on my side that you would like guidelines. My brain works and I can plan better if I know exactly what's coming. I think you could see by the planner I gave you to spell out exactly what's coming. So I've got the same type of consideration for how the outline should be, and I will take that up and provide or ensure that there's some kind of guideline as the handbook has stated, and I will come back to you, or I'll put an announcement up for that. So Karen, you do not defend your topic yourself, we do. So as a supervisor, I'm going to take my student's topic and present it to a team of researchers who will, it's probably the best way to explain it is a peer review. So I present it to other peers who are researchers, and they give their insights. If they agree with what you and I've put together in your proposal, then it is granted and you receive a letter from the IIE that you take to wherever you're going to collect your data. Or if they say, yes, but your sample is too big, or the questions don't make sense, or whatever the outcome is, then your supervisor and you will need to edit those, make the needed corrections, and resubmit again. We don't defend twice, but you are going to be required to make those corrections and submit it again, and it will undergo approval one more time. Once that is done, ethical clearance is given and you're good to go. I had one student who decided to push through December to start data collection, and the rest all waited for January, February this year to collect. And then you start collecting and writing up and submit around June next year. Or that's how the planner was this year. So more or less that's to give you the bigger picture, but I will come back with a planner or just some kind of guideline per month what's happening, so that you have clarity in terms of this particular project, and you can start envisioning more or less when you will be interacting with your sample and your population and the consent, etc. Is it possible to get it in black and white? Of course. I think this would be helpful. Yes. So Karen has mentioned a key point that I think for all of us, a guideline just for some structure and almost like your timetable that you have, a guideline similar to that with a layout that tells you what's coming. So I'm going to raise that tomorrow, and I will send an announcement regarding it, and we will start planning accordingly so that you can go into this with your eyes open, knowing what's coming. So it's not a blind, it would allow you to gain context or perspective, I think, if you are clear on what you need to do. So thank you for raising that, and I will take it up and I'll give you feedback. I just want to reiterate here if I was clear. So for all of us, you're going to load all these documents except for if you are collecting data outside of the IIE, and maybe let's say your sample is with UJ. Everybody who does have an external company or institution that you're going to reach out to, you need a gatekeeper's letter. Everybody else who's embedded in the IIE, you don't need to complete a gatekeeper's letter. And then Annexure H has the video consent already included in it. So if you are going to do a recording of some sort or a video, Annexure H has it embedded in it, so you don't need an additional annexure for recording purposes. It is embedded or noted in Annexure H. I think that's for the most part everything that you need to have. So I would say download everything in that particular folder from the declaration all the way down. Leave out the gatekeeper letter if there is not something that you require if you are within the IIE, if you're doing Varsity College, Rosebank, MSA, who else? Vega, Capsicum. If you're falling within the IIE, you don't have to use a gatekeeper's letter. Anything outside to a public university perhaps or extended, you will need a gatekeeper's letter. So I'm going to pause there and ask you, I would say use these ones that were uploaded for you here. These were uploaded by the head of education for the online campus. So I would say access them on the Learn platform, particularly here, for in case there's any changes or updates, because there was mentioned of the video consent that is updated. So rather use these annexures that are loaded here for in case the handbook is not aligned or updated as frequently as these ones are. So yeah, I would say let's follow and download everything that's in this current folder on the Learn platform. Okay, that then brings us to the end of this evening. I hope that it gave you some insight or something new. And where you are stuck or need clarity, please shout. I have made an announcement or notes on my side on what is needed. I'll raise it tomorrow and I'll send you an update as well. And then an example given on the library platform was written in first person. I don't want to go against what they have guided you on, but yes and no. I would say check in, Karen, with your supervisor because they'll do the marking. Check on their preference for that particular one. But first person is PhD level, we write in first person. So it could be acceptable. Some people prefer to write in third person. Check with your particular supervisor, please. But thank you to all of you who took the time to join this evening. Have a good evening.